Okay, so we left off in the last lecture talking about being careful about how to bring up Christian practices or biblical practices or anything like that in a session, even if you have a Christian client. Now, the reason that you need to exercise some amount of control and just kind of skepticism in a way is because even though a client might say, hey, I am a Christian, I think that's important and I want it brought into the counseling process, what we don't know necessarily is their own faith background. We don't know just by them saying that they're a Christian. We don't know the things that they hold to be important. There's many Christians who differ significantly on their theological views, on what is okay or not okay. There's many people that differ on saying, I believe that the Bible is true entirely, and other people who say they're Christians and they believe portions of the Bible that they can pick and choose. Now, it's not our job to judge and say, well, this is right and this is wrong, or this is right and this is wrong. That's not our job. But you see how if we assume that because the client is a Christian, because they've said so, that somehow they align with all of our values, that can actually be more harmful to the counseling process than helpful. Also, we don't know how they view God. We don't know how they view traumatic situations. We don't know how they view being mentally ill or having some sort of a mental health illness. We don't know how they view God in terms of crisis and trauma and death and dying. We have very, very strong opinions on how God fits into all of that. But as a therapist, we don't know all of those things. And so again, assuming that because a client says they're a Christian, that they believe essentially like we believe about crisis and trauma and mental illness and all those sorts of things actually harms the client, because we then operate from this standpoint where we're actually imposing our own views on them. Now, the other thing that is very, very important to take into consideration when we're talking about Christian therapists seeing Christian clients is the perception that a client might have as far as how they are supposed to deal with their issues, whether it be crisis, trauma, family issues, those sorts of things, in the appropriate Christian way. Now, unfortunately, a lot of churches and Christian tradition has a very specific connotation and even a timeline as far as how crisis and trauma and grieving and mental illness and those sorts of things is to be handled. And a lot of people within the church feel pressure to deal with things in a very specific way, but that actually might not feel completely right to them. And so, as a Christian therapist, seeing a Christian client, we don't know what their thoughts are on expectations. We don't know, if they are viewing counseling as a sign of weakness because they haven't been able to just pray those things away, some of those sorts of things. The other thing to take into consideration is that oftentimes, because Christians do have hope, that they have hope and faith in Christ, and that heaven is coming, and that this world will pass away, and so will pain and suffering. Oftentimes what can happen is that there's a sense of denial that is adopted for that situation where they go, you know what, it's really not so bad. If I just had enough faith, then I could get through this. Or clearly me not being able to get through this is an identification of where I'm at in my faith. And so it's very important as a therapist to be very careful about how to bring up Christian principles and practices within those sessions, because we want to be careful not to impose our own values and judgments on them, just like we would with any other client. But we also want to make sure that we're giving the client the room to explore their own faith, to strengthen and to challenge their own faith. And that's our job as a therapist, whether we're seeing a Christian or a non-Christian client.